Well, Dr. Farrell, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Where in the World is Hitler episode. Uh, it narrowly beat out the Where in the World is the Canadian Gold episode, and, uh,
Yeah,
and
that's
that narrowly beat out the Where in the World are the other 3,000 documents episode. Uh, but we know the answer to that one. They're being mimeographed, rewritten, and shredded.
it probably, yes.
Yeah,
That's probably true.
minute little changes with some whiteout. So, but one begins to wonder if all these things are related in some way.
Yeah,
The
you do. Yeah.
Start asking these kinds of questions, um, but you can end up with a polonium enema for asking the wrong
Oh,
one.
dear. Gross. That's painful. Oh, man.
But I think that's how they do it now.
The polonium enema?
Yeah, I think they get you in the hospital or something. Call you in for a routine checkup. Um, Speaking of people that die in captivity, Jack Ruby, this comment came out of the recently released JFK papers, where he invited an FBI informant down to the assassination and said, do you want to meet me there for the fireworks? And that in and of itself could be interpreted lots of different ways, although it's not like he was inviting him to Euro Disney to see actual fireworks.
No.
So, it was a little bit different spectacle. But the fact is they stood directly opposite the book repository, according to the papers. So my first question to you actually isn't about Hitler. We'll get to him soon enough. But the problem with Hitler being out there on the beaches and stuff is I think we'd notice him right away. That single barrel Speedo he'd be wearing would just be a giveaway. I mean, it would stick out like a sore thumb, or not
Don't go there, damn it. Jeez. That's not a picture I want to start out with. Oh, man, that's awful. Oh, stop it. Stop it. Stop it. That's awful. He begins, before the show goes, he begins by telling me he's sick, and he is sick.
I do. I have the flu.
So he has the flu, and so this is where in his deranged sick state he goes.
I'm not responsible for what the billions of little alien invaders in my body are doing to my brain right now and the twisted ideas they give me. But I just think somehow he'd stick out. I don't know, but or not. So back to Jack Ruby.
Yes, please.
Speaking of people that stick out at a crowd, my question is, first off, do you find anything? I mean, it seems like hindsight is perfect, and we could look and say, well, of course, in the hindsight of an assassination happened, it's really obvious what those fireworks meant. It meant come down and see a spectacle, comes down and see a display. Right. But if you weren't thinking about it, it could just as easily mean come down and see the hoopla,
Right.
So my question is, do you see sinister connotations in what Jack Ruby said?
Well, yeah, obviously I do. My problem with the whole JFK documents release is you had this ban that was extended by President Bush and then extended again by President Obama, and then President Trump lifts this thing, and you get these documents releases. And on the day of the documents, I think I talked about this too, either in a News and Views or a blog or something. I was listening to radio the day that the documents were released, and I had not seen any of them. I hadn't looked at any of them. Since then, I have looked at just a couple, not very many, but on several American talk shows in this country, and for those that are overseas, most talk radio in this country is considered to be either conservative or right-wing. It's very, very seldom is talk radio in this country considered to be left wing or mainstream or what have you. But I was listening to talk radio that day, and pretty much all day I was kind of amazed. There were some very popular talk radio hosts that had on, let's just say, a guest that kept popping up on all these different talk shows all day long. And I thought, wow, this is really kind of a campaign. And the fellow is a fairly well known uh, Kennedy assassination researcher skeptic. In other words, this guy has written books basically in defense of the Warren Report. And he was trying to put out the spin that the documents were going to exonerate the Warren Report and so on and so forth. From what I've seen, and from what people have blogged on other sites, this is not the case at all. If anything, it tends to corroborate the basic broad outlines that assassination, Kennedy assassination researchers have said all along. Now, the interesting thing about Jack Ruby, you're mentioning that he's inviting this FBI guy down to Dallas, and they're standing opposite of the Texas School Book Depository. And that makes a little sense to me because years ago, and I forget which assassination researcher it was, Daniel, that wrote a book based on the assassination and interviews with Deputy Roger Craig. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with him. He was the Dallas deputy that was one of the first sheriff's deputies up into the sixth floor, the so-called sniper's nest in the school book depository. And he was the deputy that later went on to work for Jim Garrison and then was conveniently suicided by a shotgun blast to his chest. So after having experienced other attempts, I think, on his life in automobile accidents and so on. Well, Deputy Craig gave a number of interviews over the years, but one of the things that he was always insistent upon was that he and another Dallas sheriff's deputy, I forget what his name is, that had at the same time kind of a side business owning a sporting goods shop that sold firearms. And so this other deputy was relatively familiar with firearms. And when they found the alleged assassination weapon, Craig held it up, or some other deputy held it up, and he and this other deputy both remarked that this was clearly a 7.65 Mauser, not the subsequent 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. And Craig then went on in one of his interviews, I forget where it was, I think this was an interview that actually appeared on Jim Garrison's talk, that 2 hour documentary that appeared some years after his book, where he was being interviewed by the attorney Mark Lane, who was one of the very early JFK assassination researchers. He had worked for President Kennedy in his campaign in New York, and then went on to become a big skeptic of the Warren Report and authored several books himself. Well, anyway, Deputy Craig, in one of these interviews, stated that he also had been the deputy that was responsible for trying to track the Rambler, the Rambler station wagon. And he had pulled alongside of this Rambler station wagon under the triple overpass earlier that morning, prior to Kennedy's arrival in the motorcade, very early in the morning. And the Rambler was kind of parked by the curb, and Craig looked over and saw Jack Ruby driving this Rambler. So you have at least one witness there that was involved in the assassination at the time, that puts Ruby at the scene of the crime, but at least I would imagine 1 to 2 hours earlier than the actual event. So it doesn't surprise me that Ruby would be there and be where the documents say he is. There are some people, since you're mentioning this, there are also some people, I think, that have placed Ruby in photos. The famous photo of Ike, what's his name? I can't remember his last name. That's taken of the school book depository shortly after the first shots ring out. And some people maintain that one of the blurry photos of people standing in front of the school book depository was Jack Ruby. And they also maintain that one of the people in that shot was Lee Oswald himself. I don't think you can make it out for sure and certain that either of these two are either Ruby or Oswald. But no, I don't have any difficulty believing the document. And if Ruby was there, again, I don't have any difficulty whatsoever thinking that this was part of the assassination conspiracy.
Well, and of course, having him stationed across from the book depository
Yeah,
does not, of course, imply that anything about shots coming from the book depository. It's just
right.
a coincidence we attribute to it after the fact. But that brings up another thing that and this is the only source I've seen. It's a website called crosscut.com. Looks like a news site, but who can tell these days? And but it suggests that some more information has come out of these papers that that the Seattle surgeon in charge of examining the president's wounds acknowledged to a third party that he had been pressured to change a story. That his original story was that there were
Yes.
that the one of the exit wounds in the neck was actually an entry wound. That he had tried to say that, and they kept pressuring him that it was an exit wound. And
Right.
finally, after they came up with the magic bullet theory in the course of the Warren report, he kind of did this gymnastics where he said, well, in light of all of that, in light of the
Right.
information about how the bullet travels in this wild zigzag and defies physics, then, of course, it would be an exit wound, right?
Yes.
And so, but the point that the article makes a couple of times is that that any doctor that has seen a lot of gunshots will know the difference between an exit wound and an entry wound.
Sure.
And in that sense, it's sort of like a doctor that's seen belly buttons before. You either got an innie or an outie, and it's kind of easy to tell. Or another analogy would be the classic one of, how do you know if a break-in occurred from inside the home or outside the home? It's, well, where's the glass? It's one of those things. And so this is really not that complex a thing to distinguish between an entry wound and an exit wound.
Right.
And this seems like a point that's been made before, and something that we didn't need the documents to tell us was an issue.
Right.
But the article goes on to make the point that if it was an entry wound, it would have had to have come from in front of the president.
Right.
From the direction of the grassy knoll, and implied at least a second shooter, which is what the article claims this doctor believed.
Right.
And so it makes me wonder if there's, obviously if this article is right, these two pieces of information were kept out of the initial documents. I think what's more likely is they just didn't do a thorough enough read, or these two documents would have been kept back in the 3000, and there would have been 3002 documents. But nonetheless, it makes one wonder if there's not a connection between Jack Ruby's presence at the time, along with an informant at the position of the book depository, which would be behind the motorcade at the time of the shooting.
Yes.
And shooters being placed in front of the motorcade. Also, it makes me wonder from the standpoint of an observer if this would be the ideal position to observe if you knew, in fact, where the guns were positioned.
I think, yeah, if that document is correct in placing Ruby across the street, or at least perhaps, some distance in front of the book depository. If you've been to Dealey Plaza, the street is really not that far in front of the depository. So my guess would be probably across the street. But yeah, that would be a very ideal place for observation. In fact, there were people that were filming. We always think of the Zapruder film with the Kennedy assassination, but there were other people filming that day. There was one deaf-mute gentleman that was actually on the bridge that was filming. I forget again what his name was, but he was yet one of the witnesses there that insisted that there were shots coming from his left, which would have been basically the grassy knoll. And there were people stationed filming across from Dealey Plaza, not on Elm Street, but actually all the way across Dealey Plaza, whose films were also uh, taken by the FBI and Secret Service after the assassination. So that would have been an ideal place. The doctor, when you sent those articles to me, it was interesting that the article that you sent to me before the show indicated that these doctors ended up, I think, at the University of Washington. About three of these Parkland emergency room hospital doctors had ended up in Washington. One of the doctors, and I forget again, I my memory is not good today. There was yet another doctor that was in the emergency room where they were trying to revive the president that subsequently published a book about his findings. And again, he was adamant that this was an entry wound that had been seen prior to the tracheotomy that was performed on the president, that there was an entry room wound apparently just below the Adam's apple on the throat. And then you have Kilduff, the president's press spokesman, of course, at the press conference that he gave shortly after the president had been pronounced dead in Parkland Hospital. Kilduff, I think his name was Ike Kilduff. I'm not certain, but the last name I do know is Kilduff. And of course, he's that press spokesman that puts his finger up on the right temple and says it was a shot right through the brain, and he puts his finger up on the right temple and goes like this. That's a fairly famous thing. So yeah, I think basically I'm not surprised that the documents tend to confirm the basic outlines of JFK assassination research. But you raise a very interesting question here. Was that document overlooked? Was it simple carelessness that released that document, or was it not adequately redacted, or what have you? From what I've seen, Daniel, from the documents release, it does appear that um, at least in this tranche of documents, there is enough to basically confirm the assassination researcher outline that it was a conspiracy of some sort. The real question I have, probably that everybody else has, is why weren't these, if they were intent now upon keeping that covered up, why were these documents released at all, or why weren't they redacted? I have no answer to that. I really don't. I don't know what's going on here. I do think that it's suspicious that these documents got out in the shape that they did, because the Warren report's not looking too good, and the attempt to spin it early on, again, by inviting this fellow to be on all these talk shows, raises questions in my mind, exactly what's going on
here. There's always the possibility that the original people involved are mostly dead, and
Yeah.
It all goes back to who benefited, and either the answer to that is either we can never do a perfect overlay between who benefited and who was responsible. We
Right.
say that a bunch of people
Right.
benefited, but too much time has gone by, and the network, the mess, the web is too dense to understand who's responsible. So they
Yeah.
wouldn't matter anyway, or it's the key people responsible, or the most vulnerable parties that might have folded under pressure or whatever are gone. They're dead now.
Yeah, I think David Talbot, I believe it's David Talbot's book, the most recent one about Alan Dulles and David Rockefeller and Kennedy's Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon. I think that book is fairly on target, but I think you're right. At this point, uh, the people are mostly dead, and whatever case is going to be made now about the Kennedy assassination, I think, for my 2 cents, Daniel, I think the case basically has been made over the years, beginning with Mark Lane and Harold Weiss and some of those early assassination researchers up through Robert Groden and David Livingston, David Lipton, and so on, Epstein, uh, Jim Garrison, all the well-known assassination researchers, especially Jim Marrs, who kind of assembled all of it. Um, I think their research basically has been borne out by this release. At this juncture, I think all we're going to see is perhaps icing on the cake. Ironing out a few details, changing the basic outline here and there where the documents indicate some changes are necessary. But I don't think anything is going to change in terms of the research that has been done on the assassination. I do think one thing that has changed with this document's release is I don't think you're going to see quite the uh, I don't think you're going to see quite the attempt that you used to see from certain people to defend the Warren report. There's certainly going to be still attempts made, but I think it's going to lose a lot of its steam. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Well, it's 40 years after
Yeah.
the death of de Mohrenschildt, and
Yes.
I wonder, my thought process when something like this happens, we're going to release the documents is, oh, who died this year? It would be
Yeah, exactly.
interesting for me to see an overlay with who dropped off the map that is no longer an asset risk.
Well, I can tell you, if that's your question,
Hmm.
that's an excellent observation, and I would say that there were two significant deaths this past year that may have had something to do with this release. One was Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, and then the other being David Rockefeller himself. And given Talbot's research in his book that was published last year, where you have very clear indications that the fingers are pointing in David Rockefeller's direction, although he doesn't come right out and say this, he's clearly leading there. Rockefeller's death may, in fact, have been the signal to let some of these documents out. So, yeah, there were a lot of people that died. Those would be the two, in my mind, that particularly David Rockefeller, that would indicate, now's the time for the release.
Well, another aspect of the document is, of course, and again, most of this is already sort of known, and so this is, as you say, sort of verifying the narrative that not all is right in Wonderland, but
Right.
the CBC, the Canadian journalistic organization, points out, or an article, the CBC points out that the CIA was paying a lot more attention to Oswald than the traditional narrative would have us believe.
Yes, yes.
They're well aware that he met with a member of the Russian Assassination Bureau.
Yes.
And so that in and of itself is interesting as well. I always wonder, though, when I think about bringing up that point, I feel like we're a bunch of old men who'll be like, see, yeah. And the young people are just going to be like, yeah, we're so over it, Pops. We get this, we saw this in our history books. No one's ever going to know what happened. There's a point at which the relevance is called into question, because we constantly call into question the relevance of all facts now. So whether the fact is that Oswald acted alone or didn't, I think a lot of people won't care.
Well, I think that's true. I think it's part of the cultural apathy. For me, it remains highly relevant because I think Kennedy, to me, always kind of represented the last really independent president that knew that he was up against some entrenched forces within the American government. He kind of repeatedly warned about this. In that sense, I think he kind of took off from Eisenhower's warning when he left office. But Kennedy always represented to me kind of the last really independent president, because if it was indeed a coup d'etat, as many people believe, as I believe, that the evidence points to, then you have basically a long arc from Kennedy all the way up to 9/11 of all of these bad things that have happened that seem to indicate some involvement of some apparatus within the American government. So to me, it's highly relevant. But I'm not going to try and persuade people of its relevance. If that's their attitude, then fine. To me, it's highly relevant because you see the beginnings of the outlines of a very I think a very powerful, well-connected network. What we now call the deep state. One of the things about that CBC article that did intrigue me, as you pointed out, is that Oswald is in contact, apparently, with aspects of what basically back in the Second World War would have been called SMERSH, death to spies. Basically, was the Russian counterintelligence operation, which had heavy connection to the KGB's professional assassination thing, and that that fact, plus the fact that he was friends with DeMore and Schultz, as I pointed out in my own Kennedy book, would have necessitated, by the nature of the case, an FBI file on him, would have necessitated, by the nature of the case, a CIA file. And again, the document confirms what people have long suspected. Um, so it doesn't add anything. This to me is perhaps where it does become an issue of relevance, because the documents don't really appear to do anything but basically confirm what assassination researchers have thought, for several decades. So again, the relevance issue, the younger people, I think, probably aren't going to see it as terribly relevant. For me, it's relevant because I was a boy, I was at home, I watched it all happen. So it's always been of interest to me, at least on a personal level.
Well, it always bothered me a little bit that it feels a little bit like too much theater.
Hmm.
So in anybody trained in theater craft knows that you don't just do things as they happen, but there's a reveal, and the reveal has a build up, and
Right.
and then at the right moment you release the dove or whatever the particular theater craft is, and so you have all this build up around it, and it's every few years. Will they or won't they release it?
Right.
Will Bobby and Jennifer kiss? We don't know. Stay tuned for this week of Melrose Place. There's all this theatrical build up, and then so now we have the release of the documents, and it's will he or will he not? Will he not release them all? And when we get them, what will they or what will they not show us? And
Hmm.
then, of course, there are 3,000 documents still out there,
Right.
but fast forward, however long it is, whether it's 6 months from now or never, and we have the 3,000 documents. The problem I have with it is who told us that the 3,000 remaining documents were all that remains to ever be
Right.
shown or said, that were all the documents? What makes us really believe that they also contain CIA files from that era?
Right.
That 100% of those files were put into the archive versus were destroyed, were kept
Exactly.
away from the Warren Commission and never shown to anybody. I don't understand the almost the commitment we have that everything there is that we need to know is in those 3,000 files, if anything.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, I think you're raising a very important epistemological question, and it's a question I encountered also doing the Hess book, Hess and the Penguins, because this was also the year supposedly that all the Hess documents were supposed to come out. And my skepticism regarding the Hess documents has always been the same as my skepticism regarding the Kennedy assassination documents. Because, for one thing, the documents, particularly in President Kennedy's case, would have been in the control of the government and the very intelligence agencies that supposedly played some sort of role in the assassination and or the cover up, depending on who you read. So that means that the indexes to the files could have been heavily redacted or even, just blatantly falsified, that the documents could be simply taken off the inventory and destroyed. Documents could have been falsified and added to the inventory. So, I regard the documents release uh, with a heavy degree of skepticism. For me, the real research of the assassination itself was done by that research community, beginning with Mark Lane and Harold Weiss and some of the early people that dug into it. And the same thing with the Hess case. In the case of Rudolf Hess, again, you have clear evidence from the researchers who have investigated it that documents were missing from the British archives, that the inventory of what Hess had taken with him was falsified, and some items completely ignored in the official inventory, that there is clear eyewitness testimony that this item or that item he had brought with him. So yeah, these documents releases, I think, are kind of anticlimactic. The theater was to get everybody ratcheted up, and then with the release, you have a bit of an anticlimax. And for me, that's kind of what the documents release was a bit of anticlimax. So I agree with you. I think there's an epistemological question here that really nobody's paying attention to.
Well, I saw something the other day, and it was a screening of a podcast. We have a lot of these in New York where you go, and if I had known this, I wouldn't have gone. I can think of no more boring thing. They didn't tell me it was going to be screening. I was going to go to a screening of something related to Conan O'Brien, and it turns out to be Conan is not there. It's two guys, part of his network, doing a podcast in front of me. If they'd have just told me that, I could have listened to it on the radio. And but they're doing it for Snapchat, so I guess it will disappear. It will self-destruct 5 seconds after they publish it. And they had a guest on, and it's a comedy pair, and I guess they do this regularly. But they were interviewing a JFK researcher, and this was on November 11th, and the thing is called Team Coco's Comedy Club. It's sponsored by Conan O'Brien, or it's under his brand label and so on. And I don't remember the name of the researcher. And I was kind of tuned out because it's a podcast until I heard something, and I looked up, and he was saying that then George W. Bush had sent a letter to the Dallas office of the FBI.
Yes, that's correct.
Saying that he might know who killed JFK, and that first that was strange, and then later on, Bush was asked about this in his upcoming run to the White House, and essentially they deflected and denied that it was him, and pointed to another employee, but then they came out with the fact that at the time he was working for the CIA.
Yes.
And so you got a member of the CIA phoning the FBI saying he might know who killed Kennedy.
Yes.
And that another George Bush, George H.W. Bush, oddly enough, was located and made an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency right after that was done, right after that letter was sent. And when he was interviewed, he says, I have no skills related to this. They sort of hired me out of the blue, and I quit my other job. They made me an offer, and like 3 months later, they fired me, which they should have done from the beginning. I have no trade craft here. And I guess, and so he couldn't figure out why they hired him. And of course, the obvious answer is his name is George H.W. Bush, and he's not the president. And so the guy was bringing this up, and he basically says he doesn't know why more is not made of this point, why we so rapidly forget this point, because he said, why don't people investigate this? He says it's very telling.
Well, it is very telling, and it's much worse than if that was what they said on the podcast. It's much, much worse than just that, because there are actually two documents, as I recall, where, first of all, George H.W. Bush cannot really recall where he was, just like Nixon, where he was when he got the news of the assassination. One version of the story is there was an FBI log that a George Bush had called the FBI from Tyler, Texas, I believe it was, which is northeast of Dallas over toward the Louisiana-Arkansas border. And that this,
That's the version that was recounted. Yes.
yeah, and the podcast. All right, yeah, in that version, he says that he may have information relating to the assassination. But the other problem here, and this is, as far as I'm concerned, a huge problem with the assassination and with George H.W. Bush, and that is he was involved in the Operation Zapata, which was part of the support operation for the Bay of Pigs, for the Cuban invasion of the Bay of Pigs. And it is, as far as I'm concerned, there's an excellent documentary out there if people want to dig into this, called Dark Legacy, which goes into President Bush the First's connection to the assassination and to the Bay of Pigs. It's very well argued, in my opinion. It makes a very good contextual case that G.H.W. Bush had some role with the CIA during the Bay of Pigs. Now, the problem here is when George H.W. Bush was brought into the White House staff, and we need to remember who brought him in here. That was Richard Nixon. And of course, Nixon's own recounting of where he was during the assassination is also badly obfuscated. He gives two different versions in his career of where he was. There's the Reader's Digest version, where he says he was told about it by some lady. And then, of course, there's the version that has him in Dallas at a party at the Hunts with Lyndon Johnson and some other bigwigs, including J. Edgar Hoover, on the night before the assassination. And indeed, Nixon's diaries, he was at that time a lawyer for the Pepsi company, have him in Dallas the day before the assassination. And of course, Nixon never talks about that
And
publicly.
Bush likewise.
Yes,
The
exactly.
researcher made the point that Bush was in Dallas at the time of the
Yes,
execution, and in fact had to have driven to Tyler, Texas, to make that call.
yes,
And
yes,
he says there can be no other logical conclusion, in his view,
right,
to drive to Tyler, Texas, and then call the Dallas office, then to
right,
establish that you're not in Dallas at the time that you're making the
exactly,
call.
exactly.
Although it brings up the question of why make the call in the first place, unless
Well,
you really need to establish you're not in Dallas.
yeah, you're needing to establish an alibi. And this comes up when Nixon brings G.H.W. Bush into the White House staff as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And then, of course, from there, G.H.W. Bush becomes the director of the CIA a short time after that. And all of this comes up at that time in his confirmation hearings, and his response, and this was the response that he maintained all the way up to his presidential run, was that, well, that had to be some other George Bush. you know? And at this point,
Some other George H.W. Bush.
yeah, some other George H.W. Bush is involved here, and I'm thinking, no, I'm sorry, that's stretching my credibility meter into the red zone, for the very simple reason that if you look at his connections during the so-called Operation Zapata, well, what is George H.W. Bush doing? Well, he's the head of Zapata Oil. The ship that is purchased for Operation Zapata is named the Barbara. And again, this guy that does this documentary called Dark Legacy brings all of this out. He, at the time that he's connected with Operation Zapata, he's connected with a number of people from his Yale Skull and Bones days who go on to become liaisons in the American intelligence community, some of them directly associated with the CIA, and on this goes. So, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is pretty damning that there's some sort of role that G.H.W. Bush had in whatever was going on back then, and that this phone call that he made from Tyler, Texas, really, I think you're correct here. I think it's trying to establish an alibi, because if he is in Dallas the day before the assassination, look what you have. You've got Lyndon Johnson, you've got J. Edgar Hoover, you've got Richard Nixon, and the Hunts and the Murchisons all having this, party the night before. So to me, this, as you say, this needs to be. I think it needs to be investigated. I don't know if this is going to be verified in any sense by these documents releases. I suspect not. But the evidence that is already out there is enough to me. It's kind of damning in a prima facie sort of way, and it needs to be delved into. And let me go a step further. If you recall, uh, the Watergate episode, I was a kid when that happened, and I played hooky from school as much as I could to watch the Senate hearings that were taking place and broadcast on TV. And at one point, it was Haldeman or Ehrlichman, I forget which of the two, was being questioned. It was either by Senator Ervin or Senator Baker, and they brought out the fact that in the tapes, Nixon had said something to the effect that he didn't want to talk about that because that would bring up that whole Bay of Pigs thing. Well, I suspect that Nixon is, in his typically tricky dick sort of way, also worried about the fact that he's got George H.W. Bush as part of his administration, and that he's brought in to be, the director of the Republican National Committee, and eventually, of course, he ends up at the CIA. So yeah, this whole thing, there's some sort of connection even to Watergate that I don't think has ever been paid adequate enough attention to. That's my fear, and a lot of this, uh, you know, let's be blunt here. What my suspicion really is, Daniel, because you raised the issue of theater, and I suspect a lot of this theater might be precisely to keep the focus off of Bush and his possible role, if any, in this whole thing, because everything is being directed toward Oswald. Even that weird Hitler document that popped up in this last release. This is all, in a certain sense, to me, kind of misdirection. So again, I think I agree with you. This is a connection that really, really has not been adequately investigated. In fact, even in my own book, I don't talk about it simply because um, it's so bizarre and convoluted how you have to argue to that case. But I think that documentary Dark Legacy does probably the best job of hashing out all the connections that really are there.
By that same logic, if the released documents were meant to be a distraction in favor of Oswald, then that would mean the withheld documents would have to be, by that logic, leverage over the Bush family.
Possibly.
Which would be another reason to release this particular set, which would be to restrain the Bush family from being overly critical or to compel them to do one's will. But
yeah, I do think that there may be an element of message sending in this release. I'm not certain of what it is, but my suspicion early on when I heard that this release was going to occur was, this is somehow a bit of message sending. So that your speculation there may be right on target. I don't
know. Just a factual correction. It was George H.W. Bush called the Houston office, drove to Tyler, and then called the Houston office.
That's right.
Distracted
you're right.
From the fact he was in Dallas along with
everybody else.
Johnson, Ruby, and everybody and their brother. For all we know, the entire Warren Commission was there in advance. Hale Boggs, Arlen Specter, Alan Dulles. They were all just hanging out going, when are we going to get our chance? Is it over yet? But
Well, I don't think the Warren Commission was there, but there were certainly enough suspicious people there, and apparently all of them meeting at the Hunts for a party. But
well, that's what I mean. The people that would become the Warren, but the this brings up a couple of questions. One is, you refer to Nixon's inability to recall where he was. You refer to Bush's inability to recall where he was, but those things could be taken at face value. It is actually possible that they don't recall where they were, and that would suggest interference with their minds.
possibly.
By an interested third party, and that brings me to a question, which is, for a group of people, Ruby seemed genuinely upset by what happened, afraid and shocked until he finally finished off Oswald.
Right.
Bush seemed freaked out, and of course did this. It's like I've stolen cookies and my parents are home and I'm going to get caught. And so I fill the cookie jar with baseballs and cover it up, and like, I mean, it's junior high level fix, right?
Yeah.
You go out and you have a car accident and then you call the police and tell them your car was stolen. I mean, it's not the swiftest move in the world, but
Right.
it is the move of somebody who's panicked, has not planned in advance. And
Right.
that would suggest did not know what was going to happen, at least in exactly the way it did, or
Yes,
the
I get you.
implications that it did,
Right.
or for the reasons that it did.
Right.
If they knew that something was going to happen to Kennedy, it suggests that there's a different version of what was going to happen that they were led to believe.
Right. Exactly.
And what I find interesting, because otherwise there's no reason to all be in a big party down in Dallas where you're going to be compromised, where the potential for blackmail for decades resides.
Right.
You'd want to get as far away from that as possible.
Right.
Unless the same thing was true of you as was true of Oswald. Oswald, basically, if he was involved, was told a whole different version of how it was going to go down.
Yes.
And, he says,
I'm just a
I'm a
patsy.
as though he just realized it. He doesn't say, I'm not involved. To be a patsy implies that someone is there and someone is doing something.
Yes.
If you didn't know anything, you would keep saying, I don't know. I don't know what's happening, So my question is it possible that Ruby, Bush, Nixon, Johnson, Hunt, and others were also patsies, were also duped into believing that something was going to happen, something they could celebrate, but it was something they needed to wait for. But it was, when it actually happened, it was so horrifyingly different than what they thought that they were shocked and scared, and that in fact, whoever pulled it off did have leverage over them for decades.
Yeah, I think that is very possible, at least in some of the cases. As you point out, Bush's behavior is really kind of amateurish. And I want to bring up here an interesting parallel to the Rudolph Hess case, because oddly enough, there's a phone call in the Hess case as that's unfolding, and the call is from Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering to the Luftwaffe general that's in charge of air defenses over Western Europe, a fellow by the name of Adolf Galland, Galland. And Goering calls him up on the day that Hess is flying to Britain, orders Galland to scramble fighters and shoot down this airplane. And Gallant says, there's no activity here. We've got nothing on radar. And Goering, we've got nothing coming in. And Goering says, I'm not talking, he's shouting, I'm not talking about anything coming in. I'm talking about going out. It's the deputy Fuhrer, and he's hijacked a Messerschmitt 110. Go out there and shoot him down. Well, the interesting thing about Goering's phone call is that it occurs at a time that it would have been impossible for Gallant to scramble fighters and catch up to Hess and shoot him down. So it looks to me like, again, we have at least at the minimum, a case of covering his what with the phone call. This is what I think Bush is doing. On the other hand, I have a bit of difficulty believing that Lyndon Johnson is is not in a degree of knowledge that something is going to go down. His behavior that day is just plain bizarre, particularly when you dig into all the assassination research over the years that has been done. He was supposed to be in the limousine with Kennedy. At the last minute, he insists that he rides with Senator Yarborough, who was a big enemy of Lyndon Johnson. Senator Yarborough records the fact that Johnson was apparently listening very carefully to his walkie-talkie and so on and so forth. There's just bizarre behavior on Lyndon Johnson's part, and even Governor Conway, for that matter. Again, not a big friend of the Kennedys. So I do think that there is a possibility that what at least some of these people, including Oswald, were told was something different that went down than what went down. I do think that's a very strong possibility. Oswald and his statement, "I'm just a patsy," is a clear indicator that all of a sudden they wake up and they realize that something else has happened and now they're all vulnerable. I do think that's clear. Ruby, you mentioned the possibility of mind manipulation. And again, this gets so bizarre, Daniel, because I ran headlong into that in investigating the Hess case, because there are so many indicators there that something is going on of that nature in the Hess case. And Ruby, and I mentioned this in the LBJ book, there's two ways to read Ruby's behavior on the day that he shoots Oswald. After he shoots Oswald, of course, the detectives hustle him back into the county jail, and they actually put him in Oswald's old cell. And Ruby, according to the detectives that stayed with him, Ruby is nervous and just, he's just beside himself, and he's asking for cigarettes and all of this stuff. And then when the news comes back that Oswald has in fact died, the detective informs him, "Well, it looks like it's going to be the chair for you." And Ruby's response is, instead of becoming more upset at the possibility, he becomes quite calm. And there have been people that have suggested he becomes calm because he realizes he's been successful in his mission and whatever threat that he was under has been abated, or that he was under some sort of programming, shoot Oswald and make sure you get the job done. And that, once he's informed, that the programming is switched off. Who knows? I don't know. But Ruby here is clearly somebody that I think, again, inadequate attention was focused on him. He made several pleas with the Warren Commission to get him out of the jail in Dallas so that he could come to Washington, D.C. and testify. Many people don't know that the case against Ruby was about to be thrown out of the Texas court, and the Dallas DA, Henry Wade, was attempting to negotiate a plea bargain with Ruby, which would have kept him off of death row, when, of course, Ruby ultimately dies of cancer. And again, Ruby says they're poisoning me with cancer. So very strange stuff going on here. I don't rule out I honestly don't rule out some mind manipulation going on here in the whole thing.
That brings us to
Oh
an
no.
important part of our show.
Okay.
And that is, what the heck Hitler has to do with
any of this.
With any of this. Yeah, because I'm not quite sure how he came in like a wrecking ball, but I have to say that I found it strange to claim that there was a document about Hitler still being alive in the released documents
of the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, I had to read that twice. It's like, is that really where it came from? Was that there, or was this released at the same time? Is this part of the Kennedy pile? it makes me
Yeah.
question, what is the Kennedy pile? Is it all designated the Kennedy pile, or is it designated anything that happened within a time period? You know, what
Yeah.
has this got to do with anything? But it does bring up this issue: is Hitler alive and well in Colombia? And of course, the claim is that the CIA was informed that there's somebody bearing a striking resemblance to Hitler that is
Right.
living with Nazi expats in Colombia at the colonial residences, which is a place where the Nazi expats were known to hung out. It was their club, and they didn't take it seriously. They kept treating it as rumor, but it doesn't say they ever, I think they sent somebody down there, but it doesn't say they ever undertook a real investigation of it.
Yeah, it's very strange. I'm with you. In fact, I even blogged about that document. Why is it? Why is this document in the Kennedy files release? And I came to two conclusions. Either the document was misfiled, because any report of Hitler being alive in South America after the war is going to go through, it's going to be filed with the local CIA branch office, so to speak, and it's going to get passed up, the chain of command. There's, as you say, there's no indication that this was ever followed up. There are a number of FBI files that I've pointed out over the years in my own research that have similar reports of Hitler in Brazil, Hitler in Argentina, and so on. And these are passed along to the FBI. And apparently, at one point, President Truman even ordered the FBI to undertake an investigation of some of these stories. But this Hitler document in the middle of the Kennedy files, the way I see it, Daniel, we've got possibly one of three possibilities. It's either misfiled, or it was deliberately put at a later point, just before the document's release, into those files as a bit of, ha-ha joke misdirection. Or if you follow my thesis that there is some sort of Nazi component involved in whatever machinery orchestrated the assassination, it's there very deliberately. Um, I There's nothing in the document itself that corroborates my own outline of that hypothesis. So I'm still willing to say, well, maybe this was simply misfiled, or maybe this was simply somebody in the intelligence agencies having a bit of a joke. But assuming that it's not misfiled, or assuming that it's not some sort of deliberate psyop, and assuming that it's there as a legitimate part of the Kennedy assassination documents, again, it only tends to corroborate the case that I and a few others, May Brussel, of course, being probably the earliest one to talk about a Nazi connection to the whole thing. It only tends to corroborate the outlines that we came up with. But even so, it doesn't do it in a very good way, because he's in the wrong place, namely Colombia. If he's going to be that far north in South America, it would have been better to be in Venezuela, where there's no extradition treaty between the United States and Venezuela. So again, it's a very strange thing. I'm not claiming it as direct corroboration of my hypothesis that there's some sort of Nazi international component involved. I think you have to hold open the possibilities that it's just there by accident, or perhaps even sort of a deliberate joke.
Well, there's also the fact that Hitler would freckle up pretty badly. I mean, I can't imagine him with his pale skin not sunburning out there. It doesn't strike me that being on the beach is really his first choice. I could see him going to Antarctica or something. But the point that I would make too is that Hitler, if he was still alive, I can't imagine him just hanging out in the colonial residences and not doing anything more for the rest of his life but sipping coffee and dreaming about the good old days.
Right.
And whenever I hear these things, I think of a couple of things. One is that it's part of the legend, right? Franz Ferdinand lives. There's somebody somewhere that believes everybody that got shot. The
Lives.
Tsar is still alive, and
Hmm.
Elvis is still around. That's just a tendency. And so therefore the rumors and things like that they come with the territory.
Right.
But the other thing is that when you're talking about a head of state,
Hmm.
um, even in the U.S. government, we have lookalikes whose job it specifically is to stand in high
Right.
risk situations
Right.
for a world leader. So why wouldn't Hitler also have lookalikes that were
Sure.
designed for that purpose? And of course, one would expect to find them among expatriate
Right.
Nazis. They don't have. There's little chance of corruption where they need to be executed. They've basically done their service. They're not very important, and they're on the right side. So then they end up taking the lifelong retirement in Colombia. I could see
Well,
that being a lookalike, but just not the real Hitler. He'd be
I
doing
can
something.
I can see, yes, I can see two scenarios are very possible there. I happen to think that there's a good arguable case that he did survive the war and made it to South America, but let's assume he didn't. Uh, if you're this post-war Nazi group, one of the things you might want to do just to kind of obfuscate your own trail and to keep the cause alive is to make use of some of these Hitler doubles in and around South America and let them be deliberately seen from time to time. The other problem with the Hitler survival story, although I adhere to it, is that Hitler, uh, according to the best medical evaluations that have been done since the war and repeatedly done, it appears that Hitler may have been suffering from Parkinsonism or some other very debilitating and ultimately terminal disease. Um, this seems to be very clear from the few newsreels of Hitler at the end of the war. He's got a tremble in his hands. He's got difficulty holding his head still on occasion, and these are all signs of Parkinsonism. So it would have been very difficult, for Hitler to remain alive for that long period after the war. But particularly, he was in his 50s by the end of the war, and with Parkinsonism, it's very possible that he would have died at some point had he survived the war prior to this sighting in 1955, which is in this document's release. So again, I don't have any trouble believing that you might be seeing doubles here for whatever reason. And if he does survive, all the more reason to make use of doubles so that you have Hitler's popping up here and there, and the real one is somewhere completely different, simply to put people off the trail. So I don't have any problem with that.
Well, I did know that he had some kind of problem, with some kind of growth, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure the nature of it.
Yes, and here we see him at Hugh Hefner's.
Blending back in with the animals. So it was a little bit like the island of Dr. Moreau when you think about it. Although you must admit that, despite everything else we can say about them, the Nazis were the best dressed military of their time. I mean, they really knew how to look. I mean, that beats Top Gun. That beats just about anything. They could walk the trench coat walk. They made that stuff look awesome. So we missed their fashion sense, but the rest of it wasn't that good.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah,
get
wasn't
better
worth
soon.
it.
Get better soon. The Hitler at the island of Dr. Moreau is just it's a little too much.
So, we had to bring Hitler into it. We do promise Nazis several times a year during this show. I want to ask you about a couple of possibly unrelated things, though, that we've also seen in the news as we go into the final segment of the show. And
all right,
one of those is the missing submarine, the Argentinian submarine.
Yeah, no, that's
Uh,
weird.
the missing Malaysian flight and the boat crashes. I mean, recently a Japanese tugboat, to make matters worse, if the Navy can't crash into itself, with all respect for the soldiers who died, a Japanese tugboat hits the USS Benfold in Japanese waters,
Yep.
and it just never ends.
No, it doesn't.
And so you've got planes missing, submarines missing, boats crashing. And I can't help but link this back in my mind to the most obvious technology that is taking off right now. One could say, all right, you're a conspiracy theorist if you go down the path of thinking of remote control or remote interference of vessels, of hacking and that sort of thing. But there's two things that tell me that this is the wave of the future.
Hmm.
One is what we call the Internet of Things.
Yes.
We know that hacking people's refrigerators, hacking people's home thermostats, and other things for fun is commonplace now. Hacking people's webcams now, it's a process called ratting. It's all about getting a hold of physical devices, because that's really the weak point, is when you have digital access to a physical, tangible device. It allows you
Yep.
to take hacking into the real world, to set off bells, whistles, explosions, accidents, and other things. So that's the first thing. And that also makes me want to tie this into that nuclear cloud floating from Russia over the EU,
Yep.
which the Russians first denied and apparently now have acknowledged, yeah, that kind of did come from us. Um, but the second thing that tells me that this is important is drone technology, the rise of drone technology. Because
Yes.
specifically what drones allow us to do, we need we need a military grade of remote control of military grade devices. So
Right.
we have several layers of effectiveness needed to do this. So this technology is in the wild precisely because the United States can't be trusted not to leak, and we are not the only people with drones.
Right.
So if you think about the rise of the Internet of Things and you think about the rise of drone technology and what it really implies, then
Hmm.
it's anything but far-fetched to suggest that there may be third-party access interfering with, at a minimum,
Oh,
interfering with submarines who can't communicate, who can't even get a satellite message off,
right.
apparently, planes that are missing, and boats that are crashing into each other. So I wonder if you think that all of these accidents and disappearances could be related,
Oh
and whether
boy.
or not we could be looking at um, something on the order of Anonymous or an organization like that being involved.
Oh, doff my hat on that question. I absolutely do think there's a possibility that they're connected. For two reasons. One, I just blogged about because apparently the U.S. government sponsored the Department of Homeland Security, or as I like to call it, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, um, sponsored a study where they actually did hack in. Yes,
Just
those
have to
guys.
have a picture of Homeland Security up
Yes,
while
there
we
we
talk
are.
about them.
Yes, Homeland
They
Security.
they're like a fashion conglomerate with guns. They
Yes,
don't they don't like us. They make us mention them once in a while. It's kind
and
of
there they are strutting the walk in front of the Eiffel Tower. You know, Paris, home of fashion.
oh,
But
good. I
anyway,
thought that was the Brooklyn Bridge. I was getting
no,
nervous.
no, that's jeez. But anyway, no, I do think it's possible because you had this article. I just blogged about it very recently, where the Department of Homeland Security apparently did hack into a commercial airliner as it was on the tarmac getting ready to take off. And the interesting thing is, the pilots of the aircraft didn't even know that they had been hacked. Um, and of course, you know, there were the usual denials that no, we weren't taking over operational control of the aircraft or anything like that. Um, and that ties into something else that is a story that dropped right off the radar after 9/11, and that was that Lufthansa, which of course has a fairly large Boeing aircraft fleet, Lufthansa Airlines completely overhauled uh, their aircraft and took out all of these supposed back doors that would have allowed their aircraft to be commandeered. That story popped up and then quickly disappeared after 9/11. Um, the other reason I think it's entirely possible that with the Japanese tugboat, and let me digress here because I just scheduled a blog about this because I found the story very interesting because you have an initial story where not much information is released. The Zero Hedge article was that I cite in the blog was citing a Sputnik article, and then there was another article that appeared on Yahoo shortly after that, and now the story is getting a little bit more detail. But the initial reports of the story, there weren't much details about this other than that this Japanese tugboat apparently had lost its propulsion, and that in the middle of this military exercise, this American warship is dispatched to do towing duty on a Japanese tugboat, which I find, again, very suspicious because why not just simply contact the Japanese civil authorities and have them, put another tugboat out there to haul the first one back in? Dispatching a warship in the middle of a war game exercise to do towing duty is very, very weird. To me, it does not make good military sense unless we're not being told everything about where this incident really occurred. But in any case, I do find it suspicious. And I raised the issue of could the freighters that have rammed the Fitzgerald and the John McCain have been hacked? All the focus has been on the U.S. warships and not the ships that have done the ramming, which I find very, very suspicious. So to go back to the Russia radioactive cloud thing, you and I must have been thinking the exact same thing about that, because and I mentioned this in my book, The Third Way, back in the 1980s during the Reagan administration and shortly after President Francois Mitterrand was elected president of France, there was a summit meeting at which Mitterrand and Reagan met for the first time. And Mitterrand requested some private time with President Reagan. And the reason he did that was he disclosed to Reagan that the French DCI was running a mole inside the technical branch of the KGB, and a mole that was so highly placed that he had access to the KGB's Red Book, which was their shopping list of technology that they wanted to steal from the West. So he shared all this information with Reagan. Reagan turned it over to a fellow by the name of Gus Wise to run the American part of this French mole. And they decided that what they would do was that they would allow the Soviets to quote unquote steal some of the technology that was on their shopping list, including American software, which of course was software that had back doors in it. This whole case was called the Farewell case. That was the French code name for this Soviet colonel in the KGB. Ipilitov was his name, Vasily Ipilitov, and the software was stolen, and then it was used by the Americans to explode a Soviet gas pipeline in Siberia. The explosion, of course, ruined the pipeline. It was visible from outer space. So it does not surprise me, and would not surprise me, Daniel, if there was a hacking capability, particularly, as you say, in this Internet of Things, that may have been responsible for this radioactive cloud release. It may not have been the Russians or human error that was responsible. It could be that this is, in fact, something that was hacked into. I, like you, I'm very suspicious of these things right now, particularly this Japanese tugboat incident. Now, you mentioned the San Juan, the Argentine submarine that has reportedly gone missing. It was in Tierra del Fuego on a kind of a goodwill tour, and had been ordered after it had reported electronic difficulties with its batteries. This Argentine sub is an older model German diesel electric attack U-boat that they had bought from Germany, and the Argentine Navy had ordered it back to Mar del Plata, which is their big naval base on the Atlantic in northern Argentina, for repairs. Now, if indeed this was a battery problem, the first thing that I can be almost certain of is that the captain of that submarine probably would not have run the submarine submerged. They would have been running on the surface. Because if you have a system-wide failure while you're submerged, the submarine could just plummet right to the bottom and ultimately be crushed by the pressure. So I suspect that if this is the case, that the submarine was run on the surface up to the point where it disappears. Um, would it be possible to hack into a submarine to do something like that and crash the system? Um, sure, I think probably much more difficult since this is an actual warship. And the Argentines are probably likely to have some fairly good cybersecurity. The incident that strikes me here as possibly not being hacking related is the fact that the submarine has gone missing and they have been trying to locate this thing underwater and so on and so forth. It resembles to a great extent the Thresher incident, which happened to an American submarine back in the 50s and 60s, I think it was. The USS Thresher was an American attack submarine that actually had almost a complete total systems failure and plummeted, to the bottom of the ocean and was crushed. Um, there were allegations that this was actually a Soviet test of scalar weaponry technology. This has been put out by Bearden for years. The Argentine sub incident has that kind of feel to it to me, but could it be a hacking incident? Yeah. Do I think that there is a third party like Anonymous or some group like that with very sophisticated uh, computer skills that could be doing some of this? Yes, I hold open the possibility. I really do. For the simple reason here, Daniel, that you have strange incidents going on in Russia with this radioactive cloud. And I don't care what you think of the current Russian government. I think that to endanger your own population with this sort of thing is really kind of stupid. I don't think the Russians are that cynical. Um, the Russian nuclear industry, to be sure, has some kind of outdated, outmoded technologies. We don't know what the technology is where this release happened. I would suspect that it's probably older Soviet era equipment. But I don't rule out a hack here for the simple reason that you've got tensions escalating between the United States and Russia. You've had these very bizarre U.S. Navy incidents, with the most recent being the Benfold. So I hold out the possibility that, yeah, there may be a group out there that is hacking into these things. And we've seen a lot of other hacks too. We've seen the Federal Reserve, the Sony, um, Equifax, all of these very strange hacks that have been occurring in the West. It would not surprise me that somebody may be doing this that's an extraterritorial entity.
Well, also, Black Friday is coming up and Cyber Monday, and I did find this
Yes.
on Amazon. It's a little remote control. I think you press the X for Argentine submarine, the B for U.S. Navy ship, the C for Malaysian airliner, and the D goes to Chernobyl. Which, what I always object to these poorly marked foreign electronics things where the instructions aren't clear, because I need to. You get them, you try to figure it out. You can't get your garage door open. So, but the fact is, you can buy this on the open market. I think it's $99.95 on Amazon.com.
Oh, geez, yeah,
And
create a disaster.
it won't be long before you'll be able to press a button and Dr. Farrell's hat lifts up, like on
Sad but true. Sad but true.
be able to do all kinds of stuff. Boil
No,
his water over.
you make a humorous point, but yeah, I given the hacks that we have seen, This recent Homeland Security thing, the various hacks that we've seen of various banks, corporations, credit union agencies, the famous Farewell case incident back in the 80s. I don't put anything past certain groups of people. I really don't, and I hold it open as a possibility. Funny as the little diagram was, it actually makes a serious point.
Well, speaking of serious points, you almost need a dentist for what's in the news right now about Giza, because they found a massive cavity. And I'm
Yes,
interested in that because that's a big thing to overlook, given all the research that's happened.
yes,
And my question won't be the standard one. When I hear language like massive cavity, um, it'd be sort of like saying we just found an ancient city under New York or something. It's a big deal, and it's
hmm
hard to miss.
hmm
And there's been a lot of digging down there, and so partly, of course, I'd love to have your take on what the cavity is. And of course, I think it's probably too soon to say. And you've written about this a little bit on your blog about how it relates to Chris Dunn's hypothesis and so on. But the real question I want to ask you is, um, how could such a thing go unnoticed for so long, given the degree of investigation that's been into Giza? Do you not find that in and of itself an interesting or disturbing point?
Yeah, that's another doff my hat question, because although I did not talk about this in the blog, and I think you're raising a very good issue here, because the cavity that they have supposedly detected, they detected through the use of muon detectors. In other words, they were using cosmic rays and so on, basically, to try and find this chamber. The chamber itself appears to be above the Grand Gallery and to be tilted at more or less the same angle, which raises the possibility that might be another sort of Grand Gallery like acoustical resonance chamber. But if that is the case, then you would expect other chambers to be attached to it, much as you see the King's Chamber and so on attached to the Grand Gallery. Um, I do think ultimately this is probably going to vindicate Dunn's machine hypothesis. I doubt very much that, unless there's real malfeasance on the part of whoever actually opens it up, I don't think you're going to find anything in it that's going to corroborate the tomb, the standard Egyptological line that this was a tomb. Um, the question you're raising is valid, and here's why. Back in the I think it was 1962 thereabouts, the Egyptian physicist Farouk Elbaz, who was also involved in NASA with choosing the landing sites for the Apollo missions. He and some other physicists, one of whom I think, my memory is not too clear here, may have been Lambert Dolphin, um, well-known theoretical physicist at that time. Well, they were doing precisely this type of analysis of the Great Pyramid and of the Second Pyramid there at Giza, using cosmic rays in order to detect any hidden chambers in these structures. So, in other words, the studies are very old. And the interesting thing about that earlier study is that, according to all the stories about it, the study itself never conclusively proved anything, because every time they ran the data through the computers at the University of Cairo, they were getting different results. So, in other words, the data somehow simply wouldn't cooperate with them. Every time they crunched it, it gave totally bizarre results. Um, I hold open the possibility that they may have found something way back when, and that this study simply confirms it. So I'm with you. I'm suspicious of the story for that reason. They've been doing this kind of analysis of the Great Pyramid for a very, very long time. So why all of a sudden now are they announcing that there's another chamber inside the dang thing? And more importantly, are they going to try and open it up? And if they're going to try and do that, we could have a replay of, Colonel Vice, the whole Vice scenario, um, where you had the British colonel in the 19th century dynamiting his way from the King's Chamber up into the so-called relieving chambers above the King's Chamber, and lo and behold, he just happens to find cartouches scribbled on the sides of the relieving chambers that, yeah, this was built by Khufu, Cheops. The bad thing that people neglect to mention when they point to that as proof that, yeah, this really was built by Cheops when, Egyptologists say it was that none of these cartouches were found on the walls of the chambers that Colonel Vice dynamited into. And the second problem is that the cartouches were in some cases incorrect. In other words, they were not, the errors of the hieroglyphs were so basic that they were likely not errors that any Egyptian would have made. So yeah, the whole thing there, Daniel, I think you're absolutely right. This story has a bad smell to it. It's a little too late in the game. They've been doing that sort of work for years.
Well, it is interesting that it is above the Grand Chamber. I mean, because it seems to me that it should have been obvious by now. It should have been a place that we located
Long ago.
Right. Using a variety of technologies.
Right.
But yeah, that's my question: is will they open it up? What will it hold? What will we learn? Can they do it without being destructive? What do we do? I find it fascinating. I was sort of stuck on that point that Colonel Vice dynamited his way in. Such a massive structure that you can dynamite your way in and still be safe.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's pretty amazing.
And the odds of finding a legitimate discovery where all of the so-called hieroglyphs are on all the walls except the wall that you've dynamited into. That to me casts a big pall of suspicion over the thing. And if you really dig into Colonel Vice and his account of the discovery, there are interesting indicators that he actually at some point called a halt to other people going in there. He spent some time in his tent, and then he goes back and there's more cartouches that he's discovered. I've always suspected that whole thing was a massive fraud on his part to create a discovery that he would go down in history for. I don't find it convincing in the least. Go ahead.
Well, that brings us to another question. So I have two more areas I want to cover to wind out the show, and one is the issue of treasure. So,
yes.
And this not specifically related to Giza, but it does pique one's interest because one might question if Giza does not yet have to reveal many secrets, including subterranean passages and gold and other things. But I want to kind of pivot toward what's going on with the Saudi government. So the Saudi government is doing something that I can't help. I mean, it's very medieval. It reminds me of Richard II, or I could be mixing him up with Henry IV, his successor, but I think it's Richard II who essentially confiscates the wealth of his nobles who oppose him and who oppose his desires to fight foreign wars. Confiscates their wealth, turns them into paupers, and uses that money to finance to hire his own private retinue and army and to finance those wars.
Right.
And here you have the Saudi government. I mean, and what's the charge normally laid against such people? If you want to nationalize anything, whether it's Fidel Castro's Cuba or it's the Soviet Union, if you want to nationalize something, you accuse the people whom you're about to rob. You accuse them of corruption. You accuse them of predation on the little man, and so on. And one could argue that That even was tried here in the name of Operation Rescue.
Hmm.
So not Operation Rescue. What am I trying to think of? Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
So Operation Rescue.
That wrong thing.
Wrong thing. Yeah, totally different thing. For those of you in Rio Linda, California, they are not related. They are totally different. Um, so my so as I watch this, I can't help but thinking I'm watching the works of English kings unfold, and it popped into my head as you were writing about the fake gold in Canada,
Hmm.
certified by the Canadian government. It
Right.
popped, and you were talking about what this implied. You made the point. There's a couple of points here to lead to my question. One is you made the point that the the gold, if nobody counterfeits one brick. So if there's one brick of fake, completely certified, wrapped, stamped, sealed,
Right.
certified 3 ways from Sunday, sitting in the government vaults, gold. If there's one brick, then there's hundreds.
Right.
And if they sell one brick that's counterfeit, then potentially other bricks they've sold are counterfeit as well. And of course, they're refusing to take the gold back, which is interesting.
Yep.
So at the same time, you were within the same week or so that you were making that point, you were making a different point about the Saudi capital, and you were talking about that um, regardless of their engagement in other trade and improvements in technology and something, that they live or die based on oil. That oil is
Yes.
their chief commodity. That it is their currency, their source of wealth. And I couldn't help but think of these two parallels of oil being the basis of wealth in so much of the world, and gold
Hmm.
being the basis of wealth in so much of the world. And I kept wondering, why is that? Are there oil-based economies? Are there gold-based economies? And can we look at the world that way? Can we divide it up on a map and
Hmm.
declare a good portion of the Middle East to be an oil-based economy, and a good portion of Europe to be gold-based?
Hmm.
And as I thought through that process, it made me wonder about the relationship of you pulled out in the Saudi article. I think it was you that pulled out in the Saudi article the issue of Trump trying to get the Saudis to list this company and get it on the New York
Yes.
Stock Exchange.
Yes.
And that's where oil sort of jumps over into the gold realm
Yes.
in a way. If you think that everything on the New York Stock Exchange is backed by currency that's backed by gold. Um, so my question is an odd one, and it's difficult to kind of frame it.
Hmm.
But what I'm trying to ask you is there a relationship between the nationalization of property in Saudi Arabia and its hold on an oil-based economy, and
Hmm.
what we see happening in other parts of the world with trying to make sense of a counterfeited gold economy? Could these seemingly disparate things that have no obvious relationship actually be integrally related?
Oh yes, I think so. I think you're onto something. Um, and
Because it's a crisis in both
right,
cases.
right. I think you're onto something, and I have to qualify my remark by saying, that's an intuitive guess that you're onto something. I mean, I've seen so many different explanations of what's going on in Saudi Arabia. There was a New York Times op-ed that says that this is a long-term, suggested this is a long-term uh, strategy by the Saudis to moderate their form of Islam and then use that as a platform for modernizing the rest of the Arab world and combating, the fundamentalist Shia regime in Tehran. I've seen things that are connecting the Saudi coup to the Las Vegas shooting. There are interesting indicators there to be sure, but uh, there's all sorts of speculation also about Prince Mohammed bin Salman being kind of the favored son of the current king, but not necessarily favored by the CIA because I've seen stories where they regard him as kind of an idiot. Um, there is, to be sure, something going on here, and I think one of the keys to your speculation might be we saw two very interesting arrests. We saw the arrest of a member of the bin Laden family, and of course, the bin Laden group is a very, very powerful international corporation, construction firm. It's the construction firm that the Saudis entrusted to refurbish and build out the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So, in other words, this is a very, very powerful firm. Then you saw the arrest of Prince Al Walid bin Talal, yet again, another very, very powerful man who has a lot, interestingly enough, like the bin Laden family, has a lot of investment in technologies companies. Apple, Google, the bin Ladens have been heavily invested in satellite technology and communications. Um, so, to address your speculation, if the Saudis are going to modernize their economy and moderate their form of Islam, I think by the nature of the case, Daniel, they have to be aware, given their extensive corporate connections, given the demographic handwriting on the wall of what's happening to their economy. Um, I think that they have to be aware of what I've been calling the hidden system of finance, the obfuscation of gold, both in terms of the amounts of gold, selling fraudulent gold-backed securities, the whole 9 yards that I've been talking about over the years. They have to be aware of this. And if that's the case, then what are you going to do if you're the Saudis and you're trying to diversify your economy? You have to diversify your economy, and you have to bring manufacturing to Saudi Arabia of some sort if the kingdom is going to survive. And you have to address the internal tribal factionalism. You have to address the problem of Shia Islam. The oil producing regions of Saudi Arabia are where the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia lives. So they've got a lot of problems. In that situation, what do? I think you do exactly what Prince Mohammed has been doing. You bring in all of the people that are going to be in a position to challenge that. Uh, Prince Prince Al Walid being one who is very fundamentalist in his practice of Islam in Saudi Arabia, but not so much when he goes to Las Vegas. You bring in all of these people and you either confiscate their assets and get them on board. But the real problem now is if you're correct, I think you are. Again, I think your intuition is sound. That rings the soundness bell. But if you're correct, the thing that the Saudis are going to have to do, and that we have to now watch for, is what are they going to do with this money that they're confiscating? What are they going to invest in? If they start trying to invest in diverse manufacturing, I think that's a key sign that they know that something is rotten to the core in the world system of finance, and that they are going to have to get off of the oil standard and get off of the gold standard, because that too is highly questionable. The other thing that the Saudis are going to be aware of is something that Catherine Fitz has called the continual market intervention complex. We see virtually every market in the West being subject to constant interventions from the central banks and so on and so forth in order to prop up commodities prices, in order to prop up their stock markets, and so on and so forth. The Saudis are going to be aware of that. So if we watch for diversification of their investment portfolio, the other thing I would suspect that we have to watch for is for heavy Saudi investment, and in precisely those regions of the world that are not totally under the thumb of American hegemony. In other words, I think you're going to see the Saudis try to crawl into bed with Russia and China. I think you're going to see them uh, turning more of an eye toward Europe rather than the United States, even South America. And interestingly enough, there has just been an article. I have not yet read it, Daniel, but this goes along with your speculation. There's been an article where President Xi of China has recently pledged full Chinese support to Saudi Arabia in the wake of this coup. And I thought, boy, that's extremely interesting, because if that's the case, then all of these people talking about this is really something that the Americans are ordering the Saudis to do, that may not be the case. So again, I think your intuition is sound. This is what I would watch for. I hadn't considered that connection before, but I think it's very sound, and that's what I would watch for if that intuition turns out to be correct.
Well, it's interesting. There's a
Holy
chart
cow.
from an article that I'll share in our notes that shows that
Holy cow.
there's an inverse relationship between oil and gold. That oil
Yep.
is either cheap and gold expensive, or gold is cheap and oil expensive.
Yep.
And I found that interesting. But I also find it interesting, as you mentioned, China backing this, that China has rolled out a new gold-backed oil futures contract that cuts out the U.S. dollar.
Holy cow.
And that just happened. And so people
Holy
are concerned that this creates an alternate economy that that
Yes.
enriches China on the basis of gold-backed oil futures. So
Yeah.
and that it leaves us sort of out in the cold, unaware that this is going to happen and unprepared for it.
Well, if that's the case, Daniel, then that's kind of the nail in the coffin of your intuition. That basically cinches the case.
Something seems to be going on.
Well, so yeah, absolutely, and everybody's kind of mystified as to what it is and why it's going on. I think part of it is due to the fact that, yes, Saudi Arabia, like it or not, just really, they're not stupid. Whatever we think of the ruling class there, they're certainly not stupid. And they realize that they've got to, in order to maintain their position in the world, they've got to reform. I mean, that's number one. And this Prince Mohammed has basically come out over and over again and said, yes, we realize this, we've got to change things up. But if they're going to do that, they're going to have to play ball with Russia and China. And it's very interesting to me that you just kind of cinch the case. If China has said this, they've got to have the Saudis on board. It goes with what I've read about China and Saudi Arabia. You saw King Salman very recently go to Russia for that summit meeting with President Putin. So yeah, I think you're watching a great big huge change. I'm with you in this sense too, that I don't think anybody, not necessarily in the West, but at least America, really has a grip on what's going on here. I've really not seen a clue that suggests to me that they do.
Well, this issue, this particular currency is called the Petro Yuan, Petro Yuan, YUAN. And so to quote from a CNBC article, the plan is to price oil in yuan using a gold-backed futures contract in Shanghai.
Yep.
And the title of the article is China has grand ambitions to dethrone the dollar. It may make a powerful move this year. So as I look at this, a world in which oil is sold based on the yuans per barrel instead of dollars per barrel would be a different landscape.
Oh, totally.
And if the yuans were backed by gold, and it turned out that our gold was like the Canadian gold.
Bingo. Well, you're raising the point there of the fraudulent gold, and this has been a concern of mine, as you know, for some time, because you had the German attempts to repatriate gold, and supposedly this was finished, but the Bundesbank is not being terribly forthcoming about auditing that gold or assaying it, which raises questions. And then this Canadian thing and the complete tight-lipped nature of the Federal Reserve about American gold reserves, and the fact that we have not had a full audit of American gold reserves in quite some time. There have been little pretend audits and a little bit of theater with respect to that, but nothing complete. So yeah, that could be a crimp. So higher oil prices for a period, yeah. What it's also going to do, I think, is it's going to revitalize the American fracking industry. I'm ambiguous about that whole thing. Uh, from a corporate sense, it makes sense. From an environmental sense, it seems to be very bad. Um, so yeah, there could be a lot happen in the next year. A lot of it's going to depend on whether this Prince Salman, or pardon me, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is able to stabilize the situation there. I've seen a lot of reports that people have sent me urging me to blog about it. I've refrained from blogging about this because these reports say that the king is going to abdicate in favor of his son, which I can see him doing from one sense in order to cement the succession. But from another point of view, in with the situation being as unstable as it is, I can't see that happening. So I'm kind of waiting, to see what happens with this prince. Um, there have been reports also too that the prince has offered some of these people that he's placed under arrest uh, the idea of your freedom for X amount of money. Uh, those reports again, I haven't paid much attention to because he's got them basically under house arrest. He doesn't need to do that other than as perhaps a stabilizing measure. So it's up in the air. Regionally, it's not a good thing, quite honestly. And China's moves, if this is the case, the article I cited, the article you cited, yeah. If all of that's the case, then the United States needs to, get off the pot and start paying attention to what's going on over there in a much more major way than it is.
Well, I want to ask about one other thing, which is something that I'm sure has been brought to your attention and lots of people are talking about right now, and that is the latest in the moon landing hoax. So
I'm not familiar with this. No.
yeah. Oh, okay. So let me grab the most recent news story, and then I can quote from that. So this is Newsweek from November, and let me just mute it. Newsweek from November 21st, which would be today. Fake Apollo moon landing photo claims to show proof the mission was a hoax. So after almost 50 years after the man walked on the moon, the giant leap for mankind is under the microscope again. This picture, allegedly taken in December 1972 of the final Apollo 17 moon mission, has been shared online, and it shows what one YouTuber believes is the reflection of a stagehand in the helmet of one of the astronauts. It was uploaded to YouTube this week, et cetera, et cetera. And so what the guy did was he basically uploaded a photo where the YouTube video zooms in closer and closer and closer until you can see what looks like a guy standing there wearing sort of a tunic with his hands by his side and kind of long hair and
jeans,
jeans, and it's the 70s, and there's his tennis shoes, his high tops or whatever. And so this has been making the rounds where people are claiming that, look, it's still an open issue. So yeah, I was going to ask you if I'm surprised no one sent this to you. I was going to ask you if you had any thoughts about it.
Well, I'm surprised no one has either, but most of the people that send articles know that I'm not an Apollo hoaxer.
Sure.
But I will say this, having said that, I've never also been completely on board with the Apollo, the official explanations, because there are some very, very strange things in these Apollo pictures. And some of them, quite frankly, do look to me like they have been hoaxed or staged. I don't regard that as proof that we didn't go. My own take has always been that we went, but we didn't go, and much less come back quite the way that people say we did. In other words, I think that there were some exotic technologies involved all along, particularly given the fact that Werner von Braun made that very strange statement to Time magazine that I think was really the cause of him getting fired from NASA, or forced to resign, let's put it that way. But that picture, um, what really, yeah, or that.
Yeah, there's
Uh,
lots of hoaxes out there. We
yeah,
can't
there
go
are.
for all the hoaxes.
Yeah, that's the problem. This is the problem with photographic evidence. Uh, it's always been a problem. You know, people send me pictures all the time of the latest thing, you know, on Mars and what have you. And to me, it's not the picture; it's the physics and everything else that you have to really look at for Apollo. Um, I do have a copy of the movie Dish, which was a movie about the Australian component of the Apollo missions using the big Australian radio telescopes. And in that movie, it's a movie that stars Sam Neill. In that movie, you actually see the Australian broadcast of the Apollo landing. And this broadcast is very famous in Australia because it's on the basis of that broadcast that you have the Australian Apollo hoax community really getting its kind of impetus. And I'm bringing this up because we have a lot of members on our website in the members area from Australia, including, incidentally, some people that have been connected to Pine Gap and, you know, Australian Defence Ministry. The interesting thing about that movie is that in showing the Australian version of the Apollo landing of what appeared on Australian TV, you actually do see in the actual movie this little thing go rolling across the bottom of the screen at one point, and it does look for everything like a Coke bottle, which is, you know, what has always been claimed by some of the Australian Apollo hoaxers, that, you know, what we saw was a Coke bottle. This was staged. Um, like I say, I'm skeptical of pictures. I've been very skeptical of the narrative that the little LEM, the rocket in the lunar excursion model, was sufficient to get us off the moon. Because every time I look at that thing taking off from the moon, I'm not seeing the arithmetic uh, geometric acceleration that you associate with a rocket. It just sort of pops up, which makes me think that there was an alternative technology involved. But yeah, there are aspects of the Apollo mission that I do question. I don't question that we went. And if it was the case that it was hoax, Daniel, the Soviet Union would have known it and probably uh, questioned the whole thing right from the start, unless there was some sort of, you know, super secret agreement not to do so. So I don't have any difficulty with us actually having gone. I have difficulty with how we got there and how we got back.
Well, it's been another great show, Dr. Farrell, and
Thank you, sir. Very good questions.
we'll be getting this up in the member section. And you guys heard it here. The Apollo moon landing was a complete hoax, Dr. Farrell.
No, I did not say that.
You can't believe it, but you can believe that Hitler is alive and well at Columbia. That's the university, not the country.
In the university, yes, he's not on the beach in Argentina.
No, he's it's late in life, but he's going back into the workforce, so he's getting a different degree. I think it's in human relations,
going back in
human relations or communication. Types
oh dear.
of practice areas. So,
anyway, feel better, my friend.
Thank you very much.
All right.